The deed to the Blackwood estate was signed at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, and by 4:15 p.m., my mother-in-law Margaret was sobbing into her silk handkerchief while my father-in-law Richard stood frozen in his mahogany study, staring at the cashier's check for $2.8 million that had just cleared, making me the new owner of the mansion they'd spent 30 years mocking me for even dreaming I could afford. My name is Sarah Martinez, and what you're about to hear is the story of how a combat medic from East LA, who they called the Help's daughter, became the woman who bought their family legacy out from under them, not out of spite, but out of something much more powerful: the quiet dignity of proving that your worth isn't measured by the approval of people who never bothered to see who you really are. It started 18 months ago when my husband David, their golden boy, brought me to yet another family dinner at the Blackwood estate in Pacific Palisades. The mansion had been in his family for 3 generations, built in 1924 by his great grandfather who made his fortune in oil and real estate. 12 bedrooms, 8 bathrooms, a ballroom that could hold 200 people, gardens that required a full time groundskeeper, and a view of the Pacific Ocean that real estate agents described as priceless. Margaret never let anyone forget that this house was their crown jewel, their proof of superiority, their fortress against the ordinary world where people like me belonged. That particular evening, Margaret was hosting her charity auction committee, a collection of women whose Botox prevented them from fully expressing their disdain, but whose perfectly manicured fingers pointed at me like I was something they'd stepped in. I was wearing my best dress, a simple black number from Nordstrom Rack that I'd saved 3 months to buy, while they draped themselves in designer gowns that cost more than most people's cars. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone: discussions of European vacations, private school fundraisers, and investment properties in Aspen. I sat quietly at the edge of their circle, sipping wine that probably cost more per bottle than I used to make in a week as an army medic, listening to Margaret regale them with stories about the house's history. She spoke about the original Italian marble floors, the Venetian chandeliers, the hand carved moldings that took craftsmen 2 years to complete. Her voice carried that particular tone wealthy people use when they want to remind everyone present of exactly where they stand in the hierarchy. Of course, maintaining a property like this requires a certain understanding, Margaret said, her eyes drifting toward me with the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. It's not just about the money, though heaven knows the upkeep alone would bankrupt most families. It's about appreciating what you have, understanding its place in history, its significance. Richard nodded from his leather chair, swirling his brandy with the confidence of a man who'd never questioned his place in the world. The insurance alone is 40,000 a year, cuz, he added, as if sharing state secrets. Then there's the property taxes, the maintenance staff, the gardening crew. People don't realize what it takes to preserve something like this. That's when David's sister Claire, who'd inherited her mother's talent for casual cruelty, decided to make me the center of attention. Sarah, you must find all this so fascinating, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I mean, coming from your background, you probably never imagined being in a place like this. The table went quiet except for the soft clinking of crystal glasses. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, the same feeling I'd gotten in high school when kids made jokes about my secondhand clothes or my mother's job cleaning houses. But I wasn't that scared teenager anymore. I was a woman who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, who'd held dying soldiers in my arms and made split-second decisions that saved lives, who'd earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star that these people would never understand. Actually, I said quietly, setting down my wine glass with deliberate care, I think it's beautiful. I can see why someone would want to own it. Margaret laughed, the sound sharp and brittle like breaking glass. Oh, darling, wanting and having are 2 very different things. This house isn't just expensive to buy, it's expensive to keep. The kind of expense that requires generational wealth, real financial stability. The heating bill alone in winter is astronomical, Richard added, clearly enjoying himself. Last December, we paid $8,000 just to keep the place comfortable, most people's entire monthly salary. I nodded politely, taking another sip of wine while calculating in my head. $8,000 for heating meant they were probably running an inefficient system, likely the original boiler from the 1920s that hadn't been properly modernized. With the right upgrades, you could cut that cost by 60%, maybe more. But I didn't say that, I just listened. And the roof, Claire chimed in, warming to the subject. We had it redone 5 years ago. Italian slate tiles, each one hand selected, $200,000, and that was with family connections for the contractor. Margaret's eyes glittered with malicious pleasure. Of course, we'd never sell it. It's been in the family too long, means too much to us. Though I suppose if we ever did, it would have to be to someone who truly understands its value. Someone who could appreciate what they were getting. Someone who belongs in a place like this. The message was clear, someone like them, not someone like me. That's when I made the comment that would change everything. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was 18 months of subtle insults finally reaching their breaking point. Or maybe it was just the warrior in me refusing to back down from another fight. I looked around the table at their smug faces, at their assumption that I was just another gold digger who'd married above her station, and I smiled. Well, I said, my voice calm and steady, if you ever do decide to sell, let me know. I'd love to make an offer. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Margaret began to laugh, a sound that started as a chuckle and built into something closer to a cackle. Richard joined in, then Claire, then the other women at the table. They laughed like I'd told the funniest joke they'd ever heard, like the very idea of me owning their precious mansion was so absurd it bordered on comedy. Oh, Sarah, Margaret gasped, wiping tears from her eyes. That's adorable. Really, I appreciate the sentiment, but do you have any idea what a house like this would cost? We had it appraised last year for insurance purposes. $2.8 million, and that was before the recent market increases. Plus the inspection costs, the legal fees, the title insurance. Richard added, still chuckling. We're talking about real money here, not the kind of thing you can finance with a VA loan. The VA loan comment hit like a slap. They knew I was a veteran, knew I'd served my country while their son was getting his MBA at Stanford, on daddy's money, and they were using it as ammunition. David, my own husband, just sat there looking uncomfortable but saying nothing, letting his family tear me down piece by piece. I finished my wine and set the glass down carefully. 2.8 million, I repeated thoughtfully. That's actually less than I expected for a property this size in this location. More laughter. Claire was practically hysterical now. Less than you expected? Sarah, honey, that's more money than most people see in a lifetime. That's generational wealth. That's serious, serious money. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress and picking up my purse. Well, I said quietly, I guess we'll see. The laughter followed me as I walked out of the dining room, down the marble hallway, and out the front door with its original stained glass panels. David caught up with me in the circular driveway, his face flushed with embarrassment. Sarah, wait. They didn't mean anything by it? They're just... Just what? I turned to face him, this man I'd married, this man who'd stood by silently while his family humiliated me. Just having fun at my expense? Just reminding me that I don't belong here? You know they love you, he said weakly. No, David, they tolerate me. There's a difference. I drove home that night to our modest two-bedroom house in Manhattan Beach, the house I'd bought with my military savings and VA benefits, while David was still figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. I sat in my small kitchen, with its IKEA furniture and laminate countertops, staring out at the neighbor's fence, and I made a decision that would change everything. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my financial advisor, Janet Kim, a fellow veteran who'd helped me manage my investments since I'd gotten out of the service. The second was to my real estate attorney, Marcus Williams, who'd handled the purchase of my current house. The third was to Richard Blackwood's office. Mr. Blackwood, I said when his secretary put me through, this is Sarah Martinez. I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night about the house. Sarah? He sounded confused. What conversation? About selling the estate. I'm prepared to make an offer. There was a long pause, then that familiar condescending chuckle. Oh, right. Sarah, I thought we covered this. The house isn't actually for sale, and even if it were, 2.9 million, I interrupted. Cash offer, no contingencies, 30-day close. Another pause, longer this time. I'm sorry, what did you say? $2.9 million. That's 100,000 over your appraised value. I can have proof of funds to you by the end of the day. The silence stretched out until I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. Sarah, I don't understand what game you're playing here, but it's not a game, Mr. Blackwood. I'm making a serious offer on your property. Are you interested or not? This is ridiculous. You can't possibly have that kind of money. Actually, I can, and I do. The question is whether you're willing to sell. Another long pause. Then, in a voice I'd never heard from him before, uncertain and slightly shaky, I I need to discuss this with Margaret. Of course, take your time, but the offer expires Friday at 5 p.m. I hung up and sat back in my chair, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Because here's what the Blackwood family didn't know about me, what they'd never bothered to learn in all the time I'd been married to their son. I wasn't just some girl from East LA who'd gotten lucky. I was a combat medic who'd saved lives under fire, a woman who'd invested every penny of hazard pay and combat bonuses for 8 years, who'd lived in barracks and eaten MREs while my money grew in carefully chosen funds and real estate investments. They didn't know about the 3 rental properties I owned in up-and-coming neighborhoods, properties I'd bought with VA loans and cash I'd earned dodging bullets in Kandahar. They didn't know about the tech stocks I'd purchased when they were penny investments, companies that were now worth fortunes. They didn't know about the inheritance from my grandmother, a woman who'd cleaned houses her whole life, but invested every spare dollar in blue chip stocks and municipal bonds. Most of all, they didn't know that while they were laughing at the poor girl who didn't belong in their world, that poor girl had quietly accumulated enough wealth to buy their world right out from under them. By Thursday morning, Richard called back. His voice was different now, professional rather than condescending. Sarah, we've discussed your offer. If you're serious about this, we'd need to see proof of funds immediately. Of course, yes, sir, I said calmly. I'll have my attorney send over the documentation this afternoon. And you understand this would be an all-cash transaction? No financing, no contingencies? That's correct. Because if this is some kind of joke, Mr. Blackwood, I interrupted gently, I don't joke about money. The bank statements arrived at Richard's office at exactly 2:47 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, delivered by messenger in a sealed envelope that contained documentation for assets totaling just over $4 million. I know the exact time because Janet Kim, my financial advisor, called me the moment Richard's secretary signed for the package. He's going to have a heart attack, Janet said, and I could hear the grin in her voice. I've never seen anyone request proof of funds so aggressively and then go silent when they actually see the numbers. I was sitting in my car outside David's law firm, waiting to pick him up for lunch. He'd been distant since the dinner party, walking around our house like he was navigating a minefield, clearly torn between loyalty to his family and some growing realization that maybe he didn't know his wife as well as he thought he did. The previous night, he'd finally asked the question that had been hanging between us like smoke. Sarah, do you really have that kind of money? I'd looked up from the legal documents I'd been reviewing, documents that would soon make me the owner of his childhood home, and given him the same answer I'd given his father. Yes. But how? I mean, we've been married for 3 years. I've seen our joint account. I know what you make from your consulting work. Where did this come from? That was the moment I realized that David, like his parents, had never really seen me. He'd fallen in love with an idea of me, the dedicated military medic who was grateful to be rescued from her humble circumstances. He'd never asked about my investments, never wondered why I was so careful with money, never questioned why someone who'd supposedly grown up poor was so comfortable making financial decisions that involved 6-figure sums. I earned it, I'd said simply. Every dollar. Now sitting outside his office, I watched through the plate glass windows as David paced behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear. Probably talking to his parents, trying to figure out if his wife had lost her mind or if the impossible was actually happening. His secretary waved at me through the window. a friendly gesture that reminded me why I liked David's work environment so much more than his family environment. Here, people judged him on his competence and character, not on whether his great grandfather had made smart investments a century ago. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Williams, my real estate attorney. They want to meet. Today, 5 p.m. at the house. Bring a checkbook. I texted back. On my way. David finally emerged from his office, looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 5 minutes. He slid into the passenger seat and stared straight ahead through the windshield. They think you're bluffing, he said quietly. I know they do. My dad called 3 different banks to verify those account numbers. They're real. Yes, they are. He turned to look at me, really look at me, maybe for the first time since we'd met. Who are you? It was such a simple question, but it cut deeper than any insult his family had ever thrown at me. Who was I? I was the daughter of Maria Martinez, who'd cleaned houses to put me through college. I was the granddaughter of Elena Vasquez, who'd arrived in this country with nothing and died leaving me a trust fund worth $500,000 that she'd built coin by coin, dollar by dollar, over 60 years of careful saving and smarter investing. I was a woman who'd seen 18-year-old soldiers bleed out in desert sand and decided that if I survived the war, I'd never again let anyone make me feel small for not having enough. I'm your wife, and I said, and that's who I am. Sarah, that's not what I meant. I know what you meant, David. You meant, how did the poor girl get rich without you knowing about it? You meant, how did I go from being someone you could save to someone who doesn't need saving? He was quiet for a long moment. Is that really what I did? Try to save you? I started the car and pulled into traffic, heading toward Pacific Palisades and the meeting that would change everything. You tell me. The drive to the Blackwood estate took 43 minutes in afternoon traffic. 43 minutes of silence, punctuated only by David's occasional sighs and the sound of his fingers drumming against his knee. I'd made this drive dozens of times, but today, it felt different. Today, I wasn't the outsider being tolerated at their table. Today, I was a buyer coming to inspect a property I intended to own. The mansion looked different too, somehow smaller and more fragile than I remembered. Maybe it was the afternoon light hitting it at a different angle, or maybe it was the knowledge that all its grandeur could be purchased, that its power over me had always been an illusion I'd allowed myself to believe. The circular driveway was full of cars, Richard's Mercedes, Margaret's BMW, Claire's Lexus, and a silver Porsche I didn't recognize. Looks like they called in reinforcements, David muttered. Good, I want witnesses. We were met at the front door by Margaret, who'd clearly spent the afternoon preparing for battle. She was dressed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people's rent, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup applied with the precision of war paint. But there was something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Uncertainty. Sarah, David, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Thank you for coming. We're all very curious to hear more about this proposition. The living room was arranged like a tribunal. Richard sat in his usual leather chair, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed a stack of papers. Claire occupied the settee by the window, her expression somewhere between confusion and irritation. The silver Porsche belonged to James Morrison, the family's attorney, a man who specialized in protecting old money from new problems. Please sit. Margaret gestured toward the couch that faced the firing squad. I remained standing. Actually, I'd prefer to walk through the property first. If I'm going to buy it, I should probably see what I'm getting. James Morrison cleared his throat. Ms. Martinez, before we proceed with any theatrical gestures, perhaps we should address the fundamental question of whether this offer is genuine. It's Mrs. Martinez, I corrected quietly. And the offer is completely genuine. Because we've had the bank statements verified, Richard said, waving the papers. The accounts exist, the funds are real, but frankly, we're all a bit baffled about how you acquired this kind of wealth without any of us knowing about it. There it was again, that assumption that I owed them an explanation, that my financial success was somehow subject to their approval or understanding. I'd spent 3 years of marriage being made to feel like I should be grateful for their acceptance, like I was lucky to be included in their world. But standing in their living room, looking at their worried faces, I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. They needed me more than I needed them. Mr. Morrison, I said, addressing the attorney directly, are your clients prepared to accept my offer or not? Well, there are questions. It's a simple transaction. I'm offering $2.9 million cash for this property. They can either accept the offer or decline it. Everything else is just conversation. Margaret stepped forward, her composure finally cracking slightly. Sarah, dear, you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. 3 days ago, you were sitting at our dinner table, and we were all having a lovely discussion about the house, and now suddenly you're claiming you can afford to buy it. It's quite a lot to process. A lovely discussion, I repeated slowly. Is that what you call it when you spend an evening explaining to someone why they don't belong in your world? The room went quiet. Claire shifted uncomfortably on the settee. Richard cleared his throat and looked down at his papers. I think there may have been some misunderstanding, Margaret began. No misunderstanding, I interrupted. You made it very clear that people like me don't have the generational wealth necessary to own a property like this. You were very specific about the heating bills, the maintenance costs, the kind of money required to preserve something of this significance. I walked over to the window that looked out over the manicured gardens, the same view I'd admired so many times while being reminded that it wasn't meant for people like me. You know what's interesting? You were right about one thing. It does take a certain kind of person to own a house like this, someone who understands its value, someone who can appreciate what they're getting. Turning back to face them, I continued, you just made the wrong assumption about what kind of person that is. James Morrison shuffled his papers nervously. Mrs. Martinez, if we could focus on the practical aspects of this transaction? Of course. Shall we discuss closing costs? Title insurance? I assume you'll want a standard 30-day escrow, though I could close sooner if necessary. I've already arranged for the wire transfer. Richard leaned forward in his chair. You've arranged for a wire transfer of $2.9 million? $2.9 million plus closing costs, plus a $50,000 earnest money deposit that I'm prepared to make today. I reached into my purse and pulled out a checkbook. Would you prefer a personal check or a cashier's check for the deposit? The silence stretched out until it became uncomfortable. These people who'd spent decades using money as a weapon to establish their superiority were suddenly faced with someone who had more money than they did and no interest in playing their games. Claire finally broke the silence. This is insane. David, talk to your wife. She's clearly having some kind of breakdown. David, who'd been sitting quietly through the entire exchange, looked up at his sister with an expression I'd never seen before. Actually, Claire, I think Sarah knows exactly what she's doing. But where did the money come from? Margaret's voice had risen to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. People don't just have millions of dollars lying around, especially people from her background. What background is that exactly? I asked. Margaret faltered, realizing she'd stepped into dangerous territory. I just meant... You meant poor people. You meant people whose grandmothers cleaned houses and whose mothers worked 2 jobs to pay for college. You meant people who enlisted in the military instead of going to Stanford on family money. Sarah, that's not fair. What's not fair is spending 3 years making me feel like I should be grateful to be included in your family, when the truth is, I could buy and sell all of you. The words hung in the air like a declaration of war. Richard's face had gone pale. Claire looked like she'd been slapped. Margaret opened and closed her mouth several times without making a sound. James Morrison cleared his throat. Perhaps we should schedule a formal meeting to discuss the details. No, I said firmly. We will discuss them now, or the offer expires. I'm not interested in dragging this out while you try to figure out how to save face. I opened my checkbook and clicked my pen. $50,000 earnest money made out to Morrison and Associates Trust account. $2.9 million purchase price, all cash, 30-day close. Standard inspection period, though I'm waiving most contingencies. As I wrote the check, I continued talking. I've already had the property appraised by two independent firms. I know about the foundation settling on the east side, the outdated electrical system in the servants' quarters, and the roof that's going to need replacement in the next 5 years despite your expensive Italian tiles. I'm buying it anyway. I tore the check from the book and held it out to James Morrison. The question is whether you're selling it. James Morrison's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the check, a pale green piece of paper that represented more money than most people earned in a decade. The moment his fingers touched it, something fundamental shifted in the room's atmosphere. This wasn't a bluff anymore, wasn't some elaborate joke or misunderstanding. This was a $50,000 piece of paper with my signature on it, backed by bank accounts they'd already verified. I need to make some calls, Morrison said quietly, folding the check and slipping it into his jacket pocket. There are procedures for a transaction of this magnitude. Of course there are, I replied. Take all the time you need. But remember, the full offer expires Friday at 5 p.m. Margaret had sunk into the wingback chair by the fireplace, her perfectly composed facade finally cracking. She stared at me like I was some alien creature that had wandered into her living room and started speaking a language she didn't understand. This doesn't make sense, she whispered. Where does someone like you get this kind of money? Someone like me. Even now, faced with undeniable proof of my financial capacity, she couldn't let go of her preconceptions. I was still someone like me in her mind, still the girl from East LA who didn't belong in their world. Margaret, I said, settling into the couch across from her, let me tell you a story. Richard looked up from the papers he'd been pretending to read. Claire shifted on the settee, her arms crossed defensively. David remained silent, but I could feel his attention like a weight. When I was 19 years old, I was pulling shrapnel out of a sergeant's leg in a field hospital outside Kabul while mortars exploded 50 yards away. His name was Tommy Rodriguez, and he was bleeding so fast I could barely keep up with the transfusions. He kept talking while I worked, asking me about home, about my plans for after the war. I told him I was going to save every penny of combat pay, every hazard bonus, every dollar I could get my hands on because I never wanted to be powerless again. I could see Margaret's confusion, her inability to reconcile this image with the woman she'd dismissed as David's unsuitable wife. Tommy died 3 hours later from complications I couldn't prevent with the resources we had. But before he died, he made me promise something. He said, Martinez, don't let them make you small. Don't let them convince you that you don't deserve what you've earned. The room was absolutely silent now. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to have stopped ticking. So I kept that promise. For 8 years, I lived in barracks that smelled like diesel fuel and disinfectant. I ate MREs and drank water that tasted like chlorine tablets. I wore the same 3 uniforms and owned exactly 2 pairs of civilian clothes. And every month, I sent 90% of my pay to my financial advisor, a woman who'd served 2 tours in Iraq and understood that money isn't just money for people like us, it's armor. Claire uncrossed her arms, leaning forward slightly. For the first time since I'd known her, she was actually listening to me instead of waiting for her turn to speak. While you were all studying abroad and interning at Daddy's firm and learning to appreciate fine wine, I was learning how to turn $18 an hour into real wealth. I bought my first rental property with a VA loan when I was 22. A little duplex in a neighborhood everyone said was too rough to invest in. I fixed it up myself, learned plumbing and electrical work from YouTube videos, and rented it out to other veterans who needed a safe place to land. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the gardens that would soon be mine. That duplex is worth 4 times what I paid for it now. I bought 2 more properties before I turned 25, then started investing in tech stocks that all the experts said were too risky. Turns out, when you've dodged actual bullets, the stock market doesn't seem so scary. When I turned back to face them, Richard was staring at me with something that might have been respect, or maybe just shock. My grandmother Elena taught me something when I was 12 years old. She said, Mija, rich people stay rich because they make their money work for them. Poor people stay poor because they work for their money. She'd been investing $5 a week in blue chip stocks since she was 30, turning her house cleaning wages into a portfolio worth $500,000 by the time she died. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. $500,000? Which she left to me, along with some advice. She said, "Don't tell anyone how much you have until you have more than they do. And when you do have more than they do, don't apologize for it." I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling to a screenshot I'd taken that morning. "This is my current net worth, as of the market close yesterday." I held the phone out to Richard, watching his eyes widen as he read the number. He passed it to Margaret, who went even paler than before. Claire grabbed it from her mother's hands, stared at the screen, then looked up at me like she'd never seen me before. $4.3 million, Claire said numbly. Liquid assets, I corrected. That doesn't include the rental properties or my retirement accounts. David finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Sarah, why didn't you ever tell me?" I looked at my husband, this man I'd loved enough to marry, this man who'd stood by silently while his family spent 3 years making me feel like a charity case. "Because you never asked. Because you were so comfortable with the story you'd created about who I was that you never wondered if there might be more to it." The truth was, I'd tried to tell him early in our relationship. I'd mentioned my investments, my rental properties, my financial planning. But David had always changed the subject, uncomfortable with the idea that his girlfriend might not need him to provide for her. He preferred the narrative where he was the successful attorney and I was the grateful veteran he'd rescued from a life of struggle. "In Afghanistan," I continued, "we had a saying, know your assets before you engage. You never bothered to know mine." James Morrison cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. "Mrs. Martinez, assuming your offer is accepted, when would you want to close?" "2 weeks from today," I said without hesitation. "I've already arranged financing, which is to say, I don't need financing. Cash deal, wire transfer, clean and simple." 2 weeks? Margaret's voice cracked. "But we haven't even discussed where we'll go, what we'll do with all our things." "That's not really my concern," I replied, and the coldness in my own voice surprised me. "You have 2 weeks to figure it out. The same amount of time you gave me to process the fact that you consider me beneath your notice." Richard stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "Now see here, Sarah. You can't just waltz in here with your checkbook and act like you own the place. Actually, Richard, in 2 weeks, I will own the place. That's exactly how real estate transactions work." "This is our family home," he sputtered. "It's been in our family for 3 generations. You can't just buy it out from under us like some corporate raider." "3 generations," I repeated thoughtfully. "That's nice. My family's been working for 3 generations too. My great-grandmother picked strawberries in the Central Valley for 12 hours a day to feed her children. My grandmother cleaned your neighbors' houses so she could send my mother to college. My mother worked double shifts as a nurse to pay for my education. 3 generations of women who understood that security isn't inherited, it's earned." I walked back to where Morrison sat with his legal pads and expensive pen. "The offer stands as presented. 2.9 million, cash, 2-week close. I'll expect an answer by tomorrow morning." Margaret found her voice again, though it shook with emotion. "What about David? What about your marriage? How can you do this to your own husband's family?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since I'd made the offer. How had it come to this? How had 3 years of small slights and casual dismissals led to me buying their family legacy out from under them? "Margaret," I said quietly, "for 3 years, you've made it clear that I don't belong in this family. You've questioned my motives, dismissed my background, and treated me like some kind of gold digger who trapped your son. You've made jokes about my education, my career, my family's work ethic. You've acted like David was doing me a favor by marrying me." I looked around the room at their shocked faces. "So I decided to show you exactly what kind of favor he was really getting." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Morrison's phone buzzing. He glanced at it, then at Richard. "I need to step outside and make some calls. This is unprecedented." As Morrison left the room, I gathered my purse and stood to leave. David, are you coming? My husband looked torn between his family and his wife, between the world he'd grown up in and the woman he'd married without really knowing. Sarah, can we talk about this at home? Of course, but understand something. The offer I made today isn't negotiable. Not the price, not the timeline, not the terms. Your family can accept it or reject it, but they can't change it. I walked toward the front door, my heels clicking against the marble floors that would soon be mine. At the threshold, I turned back one last time. Oh, and Margaret? When you said people don't realize what it takes to preserve something like this, you were right. It takes vision, determination, and the financial resources to back both. It takes someone who understands the difference between inheriting wealth and earning it. The heavy oak door closed behind me with a satisfying thud. The silence in our car was suffocating as we drove away from the Blackwood estate. David sat rigid in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the manicured lawns and perfect hedges of his childhood neighborhood, his jaw clenched so tight I could hear his teeth grinding. We made it exactly 4 blocks before he exploded. What the hell was that, Sarah? I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the steering wheel. That was me making a real estate offer. That was you humiliating my family. Your family humiliated themselves. I just provided the context. David slammed his hand against the dashboard, making me jump. In 3 years of marriage, I'd never seen him this angry. Never heard him raise his voice above polite conversation volume. You ambushed them. You sat there for months, letting them think. Letting them think what, David? That I was poor? That I was grateful? That I didn't deserve basic human respect because my grandmother cleaned houses? That's not what they think. I pulled over to the side of the road so abruptly that the car behind us honked. Turning to face my husband, I saw a stranger sitting in my passenger seat. His face was flushed with anger and something else, something that looked disturbingly like embarrassment. Then tell me, David, what do they think? What do you think? He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing, but now recognized as a sign that he was about to say something he'd regret. I think you've lost your mind. I think you're so hurt by some imagined slight that you're willing to destroy everything we've built together. Imagined slight? The words came out sharper than I intended. Your mother spent 3 years telling me I don't understand what it takes to maintain a property like theirs. Your father made jokes about VA loans. Your sister called me honey like I was some child who didn't understand grown-up conversations about money. They were just trying to include you. By explaining why I don't belong? By making sure I understood the difference between their kind of people and my kind of people? David was quiet for a moment, his anger deflating into something more complicated. You never told me you had that kind of money. There it was, the real issue. Not his family's behavior, not their years of subtle condescension, but the fact that his wife had kept a secret from him. The fact that he'd married someone he didn't really know. I tried to tell you, David. Do you remember when we first started dating and I mentioned my investment portfolio? You laughed and said it was cute that I was playing the stock market with my army savings. He flinched at the memory. Or when I wanted to pay cash for our house and you insisted we get a mortgage because it was more normal? Or when I offered to pay for our honeymoon to Europe and you said you couldn't let your wife pay for something like that? I could see him remembering each incident, seeing them now through a different lens. I was trying to be a good husband. I was trying to provide for you. I didn't need you to provide for me, David. I needed you to see me. A police car drove past us slowly, the officer glancing over to make sure we weren't having car trouble. I waved to indicate we were fine, though we were anything but fine. So what happens now? David asked quietly. You buy my childhood home and what? We live there? We host family dinners where you lord your wealth over everyone? The question revealed so much about how he saw me, how he'd probably always seen me. In his mind, this was about revenge, about getting back at his family for their treatment of me. He couldn't conceive that it might be about something else entirely. I'm not buying the house to hurt your family, David. I'm buying it because I want it. You want it? You want to live in a 12-bedroom mansion with a ballroom and a formal dining room that seats 20 people? Why shouldn't I want it? Because people like me aren't supposed to want beautiful things. Because I should be content with my little house and my little life and my little place in your family hierarchy? David stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? He struggled with the question, opening and closing his mouth several times before finally settling on, it's just so big, so expensive to maintain, much, so much for someone like me? Stop putting words in my mouth. I'm not putting words in your mouth, David. I'm listening to the words that are already there. I pulled back into traffic, heading toward our house in Manhattan Beach, our modest house with its modest mortgage and its modest dreams. As we drove, I found myself thinking about all the conversations we'd never had, all the assumptions we'd made about each other, all the ways we'd failed to really know the person we'd promised to spend our lives with. I called in sick tomorrow, David said suddenly. Why? Because I need to think. Because I need to figure out who I married. The comment stung more than I expected. You married me, David? The same person I've always been. The same person who can drop $3 million on a house without blinking? The same person who's been sitting on a fortune while I stressed about mortgage payments and car repairs? Yes, that person. The person who wanted to pay off our mortgage 2 years ago, but you said it would look suspicious to your law firm if we suddenly had no debt. The person who offered to buy you a new car when yours broke down last winter, but you insisted on taking out a loan because men are supposed to provide vehicles for their families. I could see him processing this, remembering all the times I'd offered to solve our financial problems and he'd refused to let me. All the times he'd chosen his pride over my practicality. Why didn't you just tell me the truth? It was such a simple question with such a complicated answer. Why hadn't I forced the conversation? Why had I let him maintain his illusions about our financial dynamic? Why had I allowed his family to treat me like a charity case when I could have shut them down with a single bank statement? Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I have. That's ridiculous. I do love you for who you are. Do you? Because the man I married just spent the last 20 minutes being angry at me for having more money than his family expected. The man I married seems more upset about his parents' embarrassment than about their 3 years of treating his wife like she doesn't belong. We pulled into our driveway, and David got out of the car without waiting for me. By the time I made it to the front door, he was already in his study with the door closed and the lock turned. I could hear him on the phone, his voice muffled but urgent. Probably calling his parents, trying to do damage control, trying to figure out how to fix what I'd broken. I went to our bedroom and changed out of my dress clothes, trading them for jeans and a t-shirt. Normal clothes for a normal evening and a normal life that had just become anything but normal. In the bathroom mirror, I looked at myself and tried to see what David saw, what his family saw. Did I look like someone who belonged in a mansion? Did I look like someone who could casually write a check for $3 million? I looked like myself, a 34-year-old woman with calloused hands from too many years of military service, laugh lines around her eyes, and dark hair that refused to hold the expensive styling Margaret had once suggested I try. I looked like someone who'd worked for everything she had and wasn't ashamed of where she'd come from. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. This is James Morrison. The family has asked me to inquire whether you might be willing to discuss modified terms for your offer. Please call when convenient. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. There would be no modified terms, no negotiations, no face-saving compromises. I'd made an offer, a generous offer, and they could accept it or reject it. But they couldn't change it. From David's study, I could hear his voice growing more agitated. Words like unreasonable and out of nowhere and I don't know what's gotten into her drifted through the closed door. He was talking about me like I was having some kind of breakdown, like my decision to stop hiding my wealth was a symptom of mental illness rather than a choice. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at our kitchen table, the same table where I'd paid bills for 3 years while David assumed I was struggling to make ends meet. The same table where I'd quietly managed an investment portfolio worth millions, while he worried about whether we could afford to go out to dinner twice in 1 week. Tomorrow, his family will have to decide whether to sell me their house. Tonight, I had to decide whether I still wanted to be married to a man who seemed more concerned with their feelings than with mine. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 3 years being treated like I didn't belong in the Blackwood family, only to discover that the real question wasn't whether I belonged with them, but whether they belonged with me. The next morning, I woke up alone. David's side of the bed was cold and perfectly made, which meant he'd either never come to sleep or had gotten up hours before me. I found him in the kitchen, fully dressed in his work clothes despite having called in sick the day before, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at his phone with the intensity of someone expecting bad news. "Good morning," I said quietly, pouring myself coffee from the pot he'd made. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes. "Morrison called. 3 times. My mother called. 5 times. My father wants to meet with you privately." "I'm sure he does." "Sarah, they're devastated. My mother didn't sleep at all last night. She's been in that house for 30 years. It's not just property to them, it's their whole life." I sat down across from him at our small kitchen table, the same table that would soon be replaced by a dining room that could seat 20 people. It was their whole life, David. Past tense, now it's real estate. "How can you be so cold about this?" "Cold?" I set down my coffee cup carefully, fighting the urge to throw it against the wall. "I'm cold because I don't want to comfort the people who spent 3 years making me feel like garbage. I'm cold because I'm not interested in soothing their feelings after they made it clear mine didn't matter." David ran his hands through his hair again, that familiar gesture of frustration. "They never meant to hurt you. Intent doesn't matter when the impact is real. Your mother looked me in the eye last week and told me I couldn't possibly understand what it takes to maintain a property like theirs. She said it with a smile. David, like she was being kind by explaining why I don't belong. She was just making conversation. Stop." I held up my hand. "Just stop defending them. For once in our marriage, stop choosing their comfort over my dignity." The silence stretched between us like a canyon. Outside, I could hear our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, starting her car, heading off to her job at the community college. Normal sounds of a normal morning in a normal neighborhood. While inside our kitchen, everything we'd built together was falling apart. "Morrison says they want to make a counteroffer," David said finally. "There won't be a counteroffer. I made an offer, they can accept it or decline it." "What if they decline?" I shrugged. "Then I'll find another house. There are plenty of beautiful properties in Los Angeles. Some of them are probably even bigger than your parents' place." David's phone buzzed and he glanced at it with obvious dread. "It's my dad. He wants to know if he can come over to talk." "He can come over if he wants, but he's not talking to me, he's talking to both of us. And if he comes here to try to manipulate me into withdrawing my offer, he can leave immediately." "Sarah, please, just hear him out." "I've been hearing him out for 3 years, David. Every family dinner, every holiday, every casual comment about how people from my background don't understand quality or value or investment. I've heard him out plenty." An hour later, Richard Blackwood stood in our small living room, looking like a man who'd aged a decade overnight. His usually perfect silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hands shaking slightly as he accepted the coffee I offered him. This wasn't the confident patriarch who'd laughed at my suggestion that I could afford his house. This was a man facing the reality that his assumptions about the world had been completely wrong. "Sarah," he began, his voice careful and measured, "I want to apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred during our family gatherings." "Misunderstanding?" "Perhaps we didn't express ourselves clearly. We never meant to imply that you weren't welcome in our family or that we didn't value your contributions." I sat back in my chair, studying this man who was trying to rewrite 3 years of history with careful corporate speech. "What contributions are those, Richard?" He looked confused. "Well, your service to the country, of course. Your dedication to David. Your your professional accomplishments." "What professional accomplishments?" "You've never asked me about my work, never shown interest in my career, never acknowledged that I might have expertise in anything beyond being David's wife." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "That's not entirely fair." "Last Christmas," I interrupted, "you spent 20 minutes." explaining to me how municipal bonds work, despite the fact that I've been investing in them for over a decade. You spoke to me like I was a child who needed basic financial concepts explained in simple terms. I was just trying to be helpful. You were trying to demonstrate your superiority. There's a difference. David was sitting on the couch next to his father, looking miserable. Sarah, he's trying to apologize. No, he's trying to manage the situation. He's trying to find a way to keep his house without admitting that he and your mother have spent 3 years treating me like I'm beneath their notice. Richard's composure finally cracked. Fine. You want honesty? Here's honesty. Yes, we had concerns about David's choice of wife. Yes, we worried that he was marrying someone who might not understand our family's values or expectations. But we've come to respect you, Sarah. We've seen how much you care about David, how hard you work, how dedicated you are. You've come to respect me now that you know I have money. That's not fair, isn't it? 3 days ago, your wife was explaining to a room full of people why I could never afford to own a house like yours. Today, you're in my living room, apologizing for misunderstandings. What changed, Richard? Did I suddenly become a better person overnight? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup like it might contain answers. Margaret is beside herself. She hasn't eaten since yesterday. She keeps talking about where we'll live, what we'll do with 30 years of memories, how we'll explain to our friends that we had to sell the family home. That sounds like a personal problem. Sarah, David said sharply, that's enough. I turned to look at my husband, this man who was still, even now, more concerned with his family's embarrassment than with their treatment of his wife. Is it enough, David? Is it enough that I've spent 3 years being polite while they made it clear I don't belong? Is it enough that I've smiled and nodded while they explained why people like me don't understand quality or value? Is it enough that I've listened to jokes about VA loans and references to my background like it was something shameful? They didn't mean it that way. How did they mean it then? Explain to me how your mother's comment about people from my background was meant to be kind. Explain to me how your father's lecture about municipal bonds was respectful. Explain to me how your sister's little jokes about bringing wine after stealing $250,000 were friendly family banter. Richard looked up from his coffee. We never stole anything. That was the original story I referenced, Richard. Your family stole my dignity. They stole 3 years of comfort in my own marriage. They stole my sense of belonging in the family I married into. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at our small yard with its modest landscaping. In 2 weeks, if everything went according to plan, I'd be looking out at gardens that required a full-time groundskeeper. The irony wasn't lost on me. You want to know what's really sad about this situation? I said, still facing the window. I actually liked that house. I thought it was beautiful. I imagined what it would be like to host family dinners there, to have children running through those big rooms, to be part of something larger than myself. Turning back to face them, I continued, but you made it clear that I would never be part of it. You made it clear that the house was yours, the family was yours, the money was yours, and I was just some outsider who should be grateful to be tolerated. That's not true, Richard protested weakly. Then why are you here, Richard? Why are you in my living room trying to talk me out of buying your house? If you really saw me as family, if you really respected me, wouldn't you be happy that someone you care about was in a position to own something so beautiful? The question hung in the air between us. Richard opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. David stared at his hands. The silence stretched out until it became unbearable. The offer stands, I said finally. 2.9 million, cash, 2-week close. You have until 5 p.m. today to accept or decline? Richard stood up slowly, setting his untouched coffee on the side table. And if we decline? Then you keep your house and I find another one. And David and I figure out whether we have a marriage worth saving. The words surprised even me. I hadn't planned to make that connection, hadn't consciously decided that my marriage depended on this real estate transaction. But as soon as I said it, I knew it was true. David looked up at me with shock. Sarah, what are you saying? I'm saying that I can't be married to someone who values his family's comfort more than his wife's dignity. I'm saying that I can't spend the rest of my life being made to feel small by people who refuse to see who I really am. Richard cleared his throat. I should go. I need to discuss this with Margaret. After he left, David and I sat in our living room in silence. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. It was going to be a beautiful day, the kind of California day that made people fall in love with Los Angeles, but inside our house, everything felt gray and uncertain. You can't be serious about the divorce thing, David said finally. I'm serious about not accepting less than I deserve. If that means divorce, then yes, I'm serious about that too. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Janet Kim, my financial advisor. Wire transfer ready to execute on your word, standing by. I showed the message to David. This is what real money looks like, David. Not theoretical wealth, not inherited property, not trust funds. This is cash I earned, cash I saved, cash I invested while other people were spending their parents' money on things they couldn't afford. He stared at the phone like it was a weapon pointed at his chest. 5 p.m., I said quietly. That's the deadline. At 3:17 p.m., Margaret Blackwood called me directly for the first time in 3 years of marriage. Not through David, not through Richard, but my personal cell phone number that she'd somehow obtained without asking. Her voice was raw, stripped of its usual polished condescension, and I could hear the desperation bleeding through every carefully chosen word. Sarah, we need to talk. Woman to woman. I was sitting in my home office, reviewing the wire transfer documents that would soon move nearly $3 million from my accounts to theirs. Janet Kim had called twice to confirm the details, her voice mixing professional efficiency with barely contained amazement at the size of the transaction. What do you want to discuss, Margaret? I want to understand why you're doing this to us. The phrase, doing this to us, crystallized everything that was wrong with their perspective. Even now, faced with the reality of losing their home, Margaret couldn't see this as anything other than something being done to them, rather than the natural consequence of their own behavior. I'm not doing anything to you, Margaret. I made a legitimate offer on a property that, according to you, I could never afford. You can accept the offer or decline it. But you know what this house means to our family. You know it's not just about money. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the small garden David and I had planted together 2 summers ago. The roses were blooming, their pink petals bright against the green foliage. Soon, if everything went according to plan, I'd have professional gardeners maintaining acres of landscaping instead of the small patch of beauty I'd cultivated with my own hands. Tell me, Margaret, what does the house mean to your family? There was a long pause as if she was surprised by the question. It's our legacy. It's where we raised our children, where we've built our lives. It's part of who we are. And what am I part of, Margaret? I don't understand what you mean. Am I part of your family? Am I part of your legacy? When you think about who you are, do I factor into that identity at all? Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her brain working, trying to find the right answer, the one that would get her what she wanted without admitting what we both knew to be true. Of course, you're part of our family, Sarah. You're David's wife. David's wife? Not your daughter-in-law, not a member of the family in my own right, but David's wife. An appendage, an accessory. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant, Margaret. For 3 years, I've been David's wife who happens to be around, not Sarah who happens to be married to David. There's a difference. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, quick and shallow, like someone trying not to panic. Sarah, please, can we meet somewhere? Can we talk face to face? I feel like there's been a terrible misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding was mine. I misunderstood what my place was in your family hierarchy. I thought if I was patient enough, kind enough, quiet enough, you'd eventually see me as more than just the girl from East LA who trapped your son. We never said you trapped David. You didn't have to say it, Margaret. It was in every look, every comment, every carefully worded suggestion about how I might improve myself to better fit into your world. Margaret's voice broke slightly. We were trying to help you feel more comfortable. You were trying to make me smaller so you'd feel more comfortable. There's a difference. I heard a car door slam outside and looked through the window to see David getting out of his Audi. He was home early from work, probably to stage some kind of intervention, to try one last time to talk me out of what his family saw as an act of inexplicable cruelty. Margaret, David just got home. If you want to continue this conversation, you'll need to call back later. Sarah, wait, please. What if we could find some kind of compromise? What if we could work something out that makes everyone happy? Everyone? Well, our family, all of us together. There it was again, that casual exclusion wrapped in family language. Everyone meant them. All of us together meant everyone except me. Margaret, let me ask you something. In your vision of this compromise, this solution that makes everyone happy, what does my happiness look like? She was quiet for so long, I thought the call had dropped. Finally, she said, I want you to be happy, Sarah. I want you to feel welcome in our family. Do you? Because for 3 years, you've made it clear that my happiness is contingent on my willingness to stay in my place. Be grateful for David's love, appreciative of your tolerance, humble about my background, and quiet about my opinions. David walked through the front door, and I could hear him calling my name. His voice had an edge of panic that told me he'd probably been on the phone with his parents all afternoon, trying to find some way to undo what I'd set in motion. I have to go, Margaret. You have until 5 p.m. to decide. Sarah, please. I hung up and walked to the living room, where David was pacing back and forth like a caged animal. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his tie loosened, his shirt wrinkled from a day of stress and sweating. They're going to accept your offer, he said without preamble. I felt a complex mix of emotions wash over me. Relief that it was finally over. Satisfaction that they'd acknowledged my financial reality. Sadness that it had come to this. And something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like emptiness. Good, I said simply. Good? That's all you have to say? My parents are losing their family home and you say good? Your parents are receiving nearly $3 million for a house they own free and clear. Most people would call that winning the lottery. David stopped pacing and stared at me. You've changed, Sarah. This isn't who you used to be. No, David. This is exactly who I've always been. You just never bothered to look. He slumped into the armchair, suddenly looking older than his 35 years. They want to know if they can have 60 days instead of 30. To find somewhere else to live, to figure out what to do with all their things. 30 days. That was the offer. Sarah, be reasonable. 60 days isn't much to ask. Reasonable? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. For 3 years, I've been reasonable. I've been understanding. I've been patient. I've swallowed every insult, ignored every slight, accepted every casual dismissal. I'm done being reasonable. I bet David's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it reflexively. It's Morrison. He needs an answer. Then give him one. What should I tell him? I looked at my husband. This man I'd loved enough to marry. This man who even now couldn't bring himself to support my decision without reservation. Tell him the offer stands as presented. 30 days, not 60. 2.9 million, not a penny more or less. And tell him if they want to negotiate terms, they should have thought about that before they spent 3 years negotiating with my self-esteem. David made the call while I listened from the kitchen, putting together the wire transfer documents that would soon make me the owner of the Blackwood estate. I could hear him explaining the situation to Morrison, his voice professional but strained. This was probably the weirdest conversation he'd ever had with a family attorney, negotiating the sale of his childhood home to his own wife. When he hung up, he found me at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of me. Bank routing numbers, account verification, transfer authorizations, the mundane bureaucracy of moving massive amounts of money. They're meeting tonight to make it official, he said quietly. Morrison will call tomorrow morning with their final answer. I already know their answer, David. They don't have a choice. They could refuse. They could decide to keep the house regardless of the financial offer. I looked up from the paperwork. With what money? Your father's been retired for 5 years. Your mother's never worked. They're living off investments and Social Security. They can't afford the upkeep on that house much longer, and they know it. David sat down across from me, watching as I signed document after document. How do you know so much about their finances? Because I pay attention. Because I listen when people talk, even when they're talking about things they think are over my head. I slid the completed wire transfer authorization across the table to him. This is what $3 million looks like when it's ready to move. Not theoretical wealth, not inherited property, not family money that's been passed down through generations. This is money I earned, David. Money I saved while other people were spending their trust funds on lifestyle maintenance. He stared at the paper like it might bite him. I still don't understand how you accumulated this much wealth without me knowing. You didn't want to know. Every time I tried to discuss our finances, you changed the subject. Every time I offered to contribute more to our expenses, you insisted on maintaining traditional gender roles. You wanted to be the provider, so I let you provide while I quietly built an empire you never bothered to notice. My phone rang. Janet Kim, right on schedule. Sarah, I have the wire transfer queued up and ready to execute. Just say the word. Tomorrow morning, Janet, as soon as Morrison calls with confirmation. Roger that. This is going to be one hell of a real estate transaction. After I hung up, David and I sat in silence as the afternoon light faded outside our windows. Tomorrow, if everything went according to plan, I'd own a mansion in Pacific Palisades. But tonight, I wasn't sure I'd still have a husband. What happens to us? David asked finally. It was the question I'd been dreading, the one I didn't have a good answer for. I don't know. Do you want to stay married? I want to be married to someone who sees me as an equal partner, not as a charity case he rescued from poverty. I never saw you as a charity case. Then why are you more upset about your parents' embarrassment than about their treatment of your wife? The question hung between us like a challenge. David opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. Outside, the sun was setting, painting our small kitchen in shades of gold and orange. Soon I'd be watching sunsets over the Pacific Ocean from windows that had been made by craftsmen who'd been dead for decades. But first I had to decide whether the woman who owned that mansion would be wearing a wedding ring. The call came at 8:43 a.m. the next morning while I was standing in my kitchen, watching coffee drip into the pot and listening to David move around upstairs with the careful deliberation of a man trying not to wake his wife, even though we both knew I'd been awake since 5 a.m. The caller ID showed Morrison and Associates, and I let it ring 3 times before answering, savoring these last few seconds before everything changed irrevocably. Mrs. Martinez, this is James Morrison. My clients have authorized me to accept your offer. I closed my eyes and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not triumph exactly, and not relief, but something quieter and more complex. The sensation of a door closing behind me while another one opened ahead. All terms as presented? I asked, though I already knew the answer. All terms as presented. $2.9 million, cash, 30-day close, no contingencies beyond standard inspection period, which you've indicated you're waiving. I am waiving inspection. I know the property. Of course. I'll have the purchase agreement ready for signature by noon today. Will you be able to come to my office, or would you prefer I bring the documents to you? I looked around my small kitchen with its modest appliances and laminate countertops, trying to memorize the ordinariness of it. In 30 days, I'd be making coffee in a kitchen that was larger than most people's entire homes, surrounded by marble and copper and custom cabinetry that cost more than most people's cars. I'll come to you. What time works? 2 p.m.? And Mrs. Martinez, I should mention that my clients would like to request a brief meeting after the signing, if you're amenable. There are some personal items they'd like to discuss removing from the property, family photographs, and such. That's fine. But the meeting happens after I sign, not before. Understood. I'll see you at 2. I hung up and stood in the silence of my kitchen, listening to David's footsteps on the stairs. He appeared in the doorway a moment later, already dressed for work in a charcoal suit that made him look like the successful attorney he was. His face was carefully neutral, but I could see the question in his eyes. Morrison called, I said simply. David's shoulders sagged slightly as if he'd been holding his breath for the past 12 hours. And they accepted. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals, made hundreds of decisions, built the small domestic life that was about to become something else entirely. So it's really happening. It's really happening. David poured himself coffee with hands that shook slightly, and I noticed he was wearing the watch his parents had given him for his law school graduation, a Rolex that had belonged to his grandfather, passed down through generations of Blackwood men who'd never had to worry about money or status, or whether they deserved the things they owned. I called my boss last night, he said quietly. Told him I might need to take some personal time. He asked if everything was okay with my family. What did you tell him? That my wife just bought my parents' house. I almost smiled at the absurdity of it, the way that simple sentence contained 3 years of complex family dynamics and hurt feelings and fundamental misunderstandings about who deserved what in this world. What did he say? He laughed. He thought I was joking. We sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and avoiding the conversation we both knew we needed to have. Outside, Mrs. Chen was walking her little dog past our front window, the same route she took every morning at exactly 8:50 a.m. Normal life continued normally while inside our house. Everything was changing. I need to ask you something, David said finally, and I need you to tell me the truth. Okay. Is this about revenge? Is this about hurting my family because they hurt you? I considered the question seriously, turning it over in my mind like a stone I was examining for flaws. Was this revenge? Was I buying their house to punish them for 3 years of casual cruelty and dismissive comments? Partially, I said honestly, but not entirely. What's the other part? The other part is that I want to live in a beautiful house and I can afford to live in a beautiful house, and there's no reason I shouldn't live in a beautiful house just because it makes other people uncomfortable. David nodded slowly as if this made sense to him in a way he hadn't expected. What about us? What happens to our marriage? It was the question I'd been avoiding, the one I didn't have a clean answer for. What did happen to a marriage when one person revealed they weren't who the other person thought they were? What happened when 3 years of assumptions got overturned in a single real estate transaction? I don't know, I said. That depends on whether you can accept who I actually am instead of who you thought I was. I'm trying to understand who you actually are. I'm someone who's been financially independent since she was 25 years old. I'm someone who made strategic investments while other people were buying designer handbags and luxury cars. I'm someone who lived below her means for a decade so she could have options later. I finished my coffee and rinsed the cup in the sink, a domestic gesture that felt strange given the magnitude of what we were discussing. I'm also someone who spent 3 years letting your family make her feel small because she thought that was the price of admission to your world. But it turns out I don't need admission to your world, David. I can buy my own world. At 2 p.m. exactly, I walked into James Morrison's law office carrying a leather portfolio that contained wire transfer confirmations for $2,900,000, plus an additional $150,000 for closing costs, title insurance, and miscellaneous fees. The money was sitting in an escrow account, ready to move at my signature, ready to make me the owner of one of the most beautiful properties in Pacific Palisades. Morrison's office was old school elegant, all dark wood and leather bound books, and the kind of understated luxury that whispered rather than shouted about money. Richard and Margaret were already there, sitting stiffly in chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, looking like defendants waiting for a verdict. Margaret had clearly been crying. Her makeup was perfect, but I could see the slight puffiness around her eyes, the careful way she held her mouth to prevent her lipstick from smearing. Richard looked haggard, older than his 68 years, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked disturbingly like defeat. Mrs. Martinez, Morrison said, rising from behind his mahogany desk. Thank you for coming. Shall we proceed with the signing? The documents were spread across Morrison's conference table like a legal feast. Purchase agreement, deed transfer, wire authorization, title insurance, property disclosure statements, page after page of formal language that would transfer ownership of the Blackwood estate from them to me. I signed each document methodically, my handwriting steady and clear. Sarah Elena Martinez, the full legal name that would soon appear on a deed worth nearly $3 million. Each signature felt like a small declaration of independence, a quiet assertion that I belonged wherever I chose to be. Margaret watched me sign with the fascination of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion. I still can't believe this is happening, she said softly. Believe it, I replied, initializing another page. Where did you get this kind of money, Sarah? I'm not trying to be rude, I just genuinely don't understand. I looked up from the documents. The same place your family got theirs, Margaret. I earned it. But we inherited most of our wealth. Exactly. The comment hung in the air while I continued signing. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Morrison cleared his throat and shuffled papers unnecessarily. Your great-grandfather made smart investments in oil and real estate. I continued without looking up. My grandmother made smart investments in blue-chip stocks and municipal bonds. Your family's wealth grew over 3 generations. Mine grew over 1. The principle is the same, just the timeline is different. When I signed the final document, Morrison gathered all the papers with the efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. I'll file these with the county recorder's office this afternoon. Mrs. Martinez, congratulations. You are now the owner of 847 Ocean View Drive. The address sounded different when applied to me. Not the Blackwood estate anymore, just a street number and a name. My street number and name. Now, Morrison continued, Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood have requested a brief meeting to discuss some personal items they'd like to remove from the property. I nodded toward the 2 people who were no longer my landlords, no longer the owners of the house where I'd been made to feel like an unwelcome guest. They were now my former landlords, people who had 30 days to pack up their lives and find somewhere else to live. What kind of personal items? Margaret spoke up, her voice carefully controlled. Family photographs, some antique furniture that belonged to my mother, Richard's father's books, items that don't really belong with the house. Of course. Make a list and we can arrange a time for you to collect them. There's one other thing, Richard said, his voice rough. The safety in my study. It contains some family documents, jewelry, things that are sentimental. I nodded. The safe comes with the house, but obviously the contents belong to you. Margaret started crying then. Not the elegant tears of earlier, but real sobs that shook her whole body. 30 years, she gasped. 30 years of our lives in that house. I watched her cry and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction or vindication, but a kind of hollow sadness. This wasn't how I'd wanted it to end. I'd wanted respect, acknowledgement, acceptance. Instead, I'd gotten capitulation through financial force. Margaret, I said quietly, you'll have 30 days to take whatever you want from the house. I'm not interested in your family heirlooms or your personal belongings. I just want the property. She looked up at me through her tears. What are you going to do with it? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. What was I going to do with a 12-bedroom mansion and formal gardens and a ballroom that could hold 200 people? I'm going to live in it, I said simply. I'm going to wake up every morning in a beautiful house that I own, and I'm never going to apologize for deserving beautiful things. The wire transfer executed at 9:47 a.m. 3 days later, moving $2,900,000 from my investment accounts to the Blackwood Family Trust with the digital efficiency that only massive amounts of money possess. I was sitting in Janet Kim's office when it happened, watching numbers shift on computer screens while she handled the technical details of what she kept calling the largest single transaction of my career. And that's it, Janet said, leaning back in her chair with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just orchestrated something remarkable. You officially own a mansion in Pacific Palisades. How does it feel? How did it feel? I'd expected triumph, vindication, the sweet satisfaction of proving wrong to everyone who'd underestimated me. Instead, I felt oddly empty. like I'd won a game I'd never really wanted to play. Expensive, I said, which made Janet laugh. Speaking of expense, we should discuss your ongoing financial strategy. This purchase represents about 60% of your liquid assets. We'll need to rebalance your portfolio, maybe consider some additional income streams to support the property maintenance. Property maintenance. The phrase reminded me that owning the house was just the beginning, not the end. There would be gardener salaries and housekeeper wages and utility bills that could fund small villages. There would be property taxes that exceeded most people's annual income and insurance premiums that reflected the reality of owning something worth nearly $3 million. Send me the projections, and I said. I want to understand exactly what I've gotten myself into. The drive from Janet's office in Century City to my new house in Pacific Palisades took 23 minutes through mid morning traffic. 23 minutes of processing the fact that I was about to walk into a mansion I owned. A mansion where I'd been made to feel like an intruder for 3 years. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd bought my way into belonging somewhere I'd never actually wanted to be. The Blackwood estate looked different when approached as an owner rather than a guest. The circular driveway seemed smaller, the imposing facade less intimidating. It was still beautiful, still grand, still the kind of property that made people stop their cars to stare, but it was also just a house. My house with my mortgage-free deed, in my possession, and my name on the title insurance policy. I parked in the same spot where I'd parked for dozens of family dinners, but this time I used the key that Morrison had handed me along with the final closing documents. The heavy oak door swung open to reveal the marble foyer I'd walked through so many times as David's wife, the unwelcome daughter-in-law who didn't understand quality or value, or what it meant to preserve something significant. The house was empty but not vacant. The Blackwoods had removed their personal belongings but left the furniture, the artwork, the carefully curated collection of expensive objects that had been part of their identity for 30 years. Walking through the rooms felt like exploring a museum exhibit about wealth, a preserved example of how rich people lived when they wanted everyone to know they were rich. In the formal dining room, the mahogany table where I'd endured so many uncomfortable meals still dominated the space, surrounded by chairs upholstered in fabric that cost more per yard than most people spent on entire outfits. The chandelier Margaret had been so proud of, the one she'd mentioned, was authentic Venetian crystal. Cast rainbow patterns across walls that would soon be repainted in colors I chose instead of colors chosen by people who'd never wanted me there. The kitchen was a monument to expensive functionality. All marble countertops and commercial-grade appliances and custom cabinetry that had been handcrafted by artisans whose names Margaret used to drop in casual conversation. I ran my fingers along the granite breakfast bar where Richard had once explained municipal bonds to me like I was a child, remembering the condescending smile he'd worn while educating me about investment strategies I'd been using successfully for over a decade. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Are you at the house? We need to talk." I looked around the empty kitchen, trying to imagine cooking breakfast in a space larger than most people's entire homes, trying to picture myself as the kind of person who owned a kitchen with 2 dishwashers and a wine refrigerator that held more bottles than I'd consumed in my entire life. "I'm here," I texted back. "The front door is unlocked." 20 minutes later, David walked into his childhood home carrying a bottle of champagne and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. He looked around the empty rooms with the bewildered air of someone visiting a place that used to be familiar but had somehow become foreign. "Congratulations," he said, holding up the champagne. "You own a mansion." "We own a mansion," I corrected automatically, though I wasn't sure why. Community property laws meant that anything acquired during marriage belonged to both spouses, but this felt different, personal, like something I'd accomplished alone despite being married. David set the champagne on the kitchen counter and looked around the space where his mother had spent 30 years creating elaborate dinner parties designed to remind everyone of their place in the social hierarchy. "It's weird being here when it's not theirs anymore," he said. "It's weird being here when it is mine." We stood in the empty kitchen, two people who'd been married for 3 years but felt like strangers to each other, surrounded by the expensive infrastructure of a life neither of us had actually chosen. "I've been thinking about what you said," David continued, "about whether I see you as an equal partner or as someone I rescued. And And I think you're right. I think I did see our marriage as me providing for you, protecting you, giving you access to a world you couldn't have reached on your own. The admission hung between us like a confession. I'd known it, of course, had felt it in 1,000 small interactions over 3 years of marriage, but hearing him say it out loud was different. It was validation and heartbreak at the same time. The thing is, David continued, I don't know how to be married to someone who doesn't need me to provide for them. I don't know what my role is if you can buy whatever you want, live wherever you want, do whatever you want without considering my opinion or my income or my family's approval. I walked to the window that looked out over the gardens where Margaret had hosted charity luncheons for causes she supported more for social status than genuine concern. Professional landscapers had maintained these grounds for decades, creating a perfect backdrop for events designed to reinforce the social order that kept people like the Blackwoods at the top and people like me grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance they chose to offer. Your role, I said without turning around, would be to be my partner, not my provider or my protector or my guide to a world I supposedly don't understand, but my equal partner in whatever life we decide to build together. But what if I don't know how to do that? It was an honest question, probably the most honest thing David had said to me since this whole situation began. What if he didn't know how to be married to an equal? What if 3 years of assumptions about our relative positions couldn't be overcome by a single real estate transaction? Then maybe we're not compatible, I said, finally turning to face him. David winced as if I'd slapped him. Is that what you want? Divorce? I want to be married to someone who's excited about my success instead of threatened by it. I want to be married to someone who stands up for me when his family treats me badly instead of making excuses for their behavior. I want to be married to someone who sees my strength as an asset to our relationship instead of a challenge to his masculinity. I can learn to be that person. Can you? Because it's not just about changing your behavior, David. It's about changing how you see me, how you see us, how you see what marriage means. My phone rang, interrupting the conversation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway, grateful for the distraction. Mrs. Martinez, this is Elena Rodriguez from Architectural Digest. We heard about your recent purchase of the Blackwood estate, and we'd love to feature the property in an upcoming issue about historic Los Angeles homes. Would you be interested in discussing a photo shoot? I looked around the empty mansion, imagining photographers capturing the rooms where I'd been made to feel small, turning them into glossy magazine pages that would celebrate my ownership of beauty I'd always deserved. Yes, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I'd be very interested. After I hung up, David stared at me with something approaching awe. Architectural Digest wants to photograph the house? They want to photograph my house, I corrected. And yes, they do. David opened the champagne then, the cork flying across the empty kitchen, with a satisfying pop that echoed through rooms that had heard decades of celebration, but never any that belonged to me. To Sarah Martinez, he said, raising the bottle in lieu of glasses, owner of the most beautiful house in Pacific Palisades. To Sarah Martinez, I agreed, taking the bottle from him and drinking champagne that tasted like freedom and possibility, and the sweet satisfaction of proving that belonging isn't something you're granted by other people, it's something you claim for yourself. But as the bubbles fizzed on my tongue, I wondered if owning the house would be enough, or if there were still more battles to fight, more assumptions to overturn, more ways that people would try to make me feel like I didn't deserve the beautiful life I'd built with my own hands and my own money and my own uncompromising refusal to stay small. The house was mine now, but the war for respect was far from over. The confrontation I'd been expecting came 2 weeks later, delivered not through lawyers or formal channels, but in the form of Margaret Blackwood standing on my front porch at 7:30 in the morning, her perfectly coiffed hair slightly disheveled and her designer handbag clutched like a weapon. She looked like she hadn't slept, which was probably true, and she looked like she had something to say, which was definitely true. I opened the door in my pajamas and robe, coffee mug in hand, looking like someone who belonged in a mansion because I did belong in a mansion. The marble foyer stretched behind me, my marble foyer now, and I watched Margaret's eyes take in the familiar space that was no longer hers. We need to talk, she said without preamble. Good morning to you too, Margaret. Would you like to come in? She brushed past me into the foyer, her heels clicking against the marble floors she'd walked on for 30 years, and I realized this was probably the first time she'd ever entered this house without owning it. The shift in power dynamics was almost tangible. I came to ask you to reconsider, she said, turning to face me in the room where she'd once held court over family gatherings designed to remind everyone of their place in her hierarchy. Reconsider what? This whole situation, this purchase, this whatever this is you're doing to our family. I sipped my coffee and studied Margaret's face, looking for the woman who'd spent 3 years explaining to me why I didn't belong in her world. She was still there, underneath the desperation and the sleepless nights, but she looked smaller somehow, diminished by the loss of the backdrop that had given her so much of her power. I'm not doing anything to your family, Margaret. I bought a house. People buy houses every day. Not from their own in-laws, not as some kind of revenge scheme. Revenge scheme? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Margaret, you seem to be operating under the misapprehension that this is about you. It's not. This is about me wanting to live in a beautiful house and having the financial means to make that happen. Margaret's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Don't pretend this isn't personal, Sarah. Don't pretend you didn't buy this house to hurt us. Did I hurt you? Good. Maybe now you understand what it feels like to be dismissed and underestimated and treated like you don't belong somewhere. We never treated you like you didn't belong. Stop. I held up my hand. Just stop. Don't rewrite history to make yourself feel better about what you did. You spent 3 years making sure I knew exactly where I stood in your family's hierarchy, and it wasn't at the top. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration, of someone who'd lost control of a situation she'd always been able to manipulate through social pressure and emotional manipulation. You've destroyed everything, she whispered. 30 years of our lives, our memories, our security, all because you couldn't take a joke. A joke? The words came out sharper than I intended. Your joke's about my background, about my inability to understand quality, about people like me not belonging in places like this. Those jokes? You're being oversensitive. I'm being human. I'm responding to 3 years of being made to feel like a charity case your son married out of pity. Margaret straightened her shoulders, trying to summon the authoritative presence that had once made me feel small. David loves you. We all accepted you into our family. We tried to help you fit in. Help me fit in by changing who I am to match your expectations. Help me fit in by staying quiet when you make assumptions about my finances, my education, and my worth as a person. I walked to the window that looked out over the same gardens where Margaret had hosted charity luncheons designed to reinforce the social pecking order she was now finding herself at the bottom of. Do you know what's funny, Margaret? I actually tried to like you. I wanted to be part of your family, wanted to belong to something bigger than myself. But you made it clear that belonging came with conditions, and those conditions all involved me becoming smaller, quieter, more grateful. That's not true. It is true. And the irony is that while you were busy explaining to me why I couldn't afford to live in a house like this, I was quietly accumulating enough wealth to buy it right out from under you. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, looking around the foyer that had once been the center of her domain. Where are we supposed to go? We've lived here for 30 years. This is our home. I gave you 30 days to figure that out. How much time have you had? 2 weeks. Then you have 2 weeks left. But Richard's health isn't good. The stress of moving, of finding a new place, of starting over at our age, should have been considered before you decided to treat your son's wife like hired help. The words hung in the air between us, harsher than I'd intended, but true nonetheless. Margaret's face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. I came here to ask for your forgiveness, she said quietly. I came here to apologize for whatever we did that hurt you so badly you'd do this to us. Your apology is noted, Margaret. But apologies don't undo 3 years of damage, and they don't change the fact that I own this house now. What do you want from us? What would it take for you to reconsider this sale? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since the wire transfer had cleared. What did I want? An apology? Recognition? Acknowledgement that I'd been right to feel hurt by their treatment? I want nothing from you, Margaret. That's what you never understood. I don't need your approval, your acceptance, or your social connections. I never did. Then why did you buy our house? Because I wanted it. Because I could afford it. Because there's no reason I shouldn't live somewhere beautiful just because it makes you uncomfortable. Margaret's phone buzzed and she glanced at it automatically. It's Richard. He's wondering if we've made any progress. Tell Richard that progress would have been treating me with basic human dignity from the beginning. Tell him that progress would have been acknowledging that I might have something valuable to contribute to your family beyond being grateful for your son's attention. We did acknowledge that. When? When did you acknowledge that I might be intelligent, capable, financially sophisticated? When did you treat me like an equal instead of a project? Margaret was quiet, and I could see her mentally reviewing 3 years of family interactions, looking for examples of respect and acceptance, and coming up empty. I don't know how to fix this, she said finally. You can't fix it, Margaret. Some things can't be undone. Some hurt runs too deep to be healed with apologies and last minute attempts at reconciliation. So that's it? You're just going to live in our house and pretend we don't exist? I'm going to live in my house and build whatever life I choose to build. Whether that includes you depends on whether you can accept that I was never the person you thought I was. Margaret walked to the door, her heels echoing in the marble foyer. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. I hope you're happy, Sarah. I hope this house gives you whatever it is you're looking for. It already has, Margaret. It's given me proof that I belong anywhere I choose to be. After she left, I stood in my foyer, surrounded by the marble and crystal and expensive furniture that had once been symbols of everything I supposedly couldn't understand or afford. The house felt different now, less like a trophy and more like what it had always been, a beautiful place where someone could build a life. My phone rang, David calling from his office. My mother just called. She said she went to see you. She did. She's crying. She said you won't consider selling the house back to them. I won't. Sarah, please. Can't we find some kind of compromise? David, I've spent 3 years compromising. I've compromised my dignity, my self-respect, my sense of belonging in my own marriage. I'm done compromising. What does that mean? It means your mother has 2 weeks to pack up her things and find somewhere else to live. And it means you need to decide whether you want to be married to the woman who owns this house or whether you want to keep trying to convince me to be someone I'm not. The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know about where David's loyalties lay. And for the first time since this whole situation began, I felt truly free. I was done being small to make other people comfortable. I was done apologizing for having more than people expected me to have. I was done being grateful for scraps of acceptance from people who'd never deserved my respect in the first place. The house was mine, and I was done pretending that was anything other than exactly what I'd earned. The moving trucks arrived at 6 a.m. on the final day, rumbling up the circular driveway like mechanical vultures, came to pick and clean the bones of the Blackwood legacy. I watched from the master bedroom window, coffee in hand, as 3 burly men in matching uniforms began the methodical process of loading 30 years of accumulated wealth into vehicles that would carry it away from the house that was no longer home to the people who'd called it home for 3 decades. Margaret stood on the front lawn directing the operation with the rigid precision of a general commanding a retreat. She was wearing all black, as if she were attending a funeral, which in a way she was. The funeral of her identity as the woman who lived in the big house on Ocean View Drive, the woman whose address alone had been a source of power and prestige in her social circle. Richard sat in his Mercedes, engine running, staring at the house through the windshield with the hollow expression of someone watching their life be dismantled box by box. He looked older than his 68 years, diminished by the loss of the backdrop that had given him so much of his authority. Without the mansion to frame him, he was just another elderly man in an expensive car, watching strangers handle his possessions with the casual indifference of people who were paid to move things rather than understand their significance. David was conspicuously absent. He'd called the night before to tell me he'd be staying at a hotel until his parents were settled, that he couldn't bear to watch them lose their home, that seeing their pain was too much for him to handle. I'd listened to his explanation with the detached interest of someone observing a play they'd seen too many times before. "So you're choosing them," I'd said when he finished talking. "I'm not choosing anyone. I'm just trying to minimize the damage." "The damage is already done, David. It was done 3 years ago when you let them treat me like I was beneath their notice. Everything that's happened since then is just a consequence." He'd hung up without saying goodbye, and I'd spent the night alone in a 12-bedroom mansion, listening to the house settle around me like a living thing adjusting to new ownership. In the morning, I'd watched his parents' life being loaded into trucks while my husband hid in a hotel room, unable to face the reality of what his family's behavior had cost them all. By noon, the trucks were gone, and the house was truly mine in a way it had never been before. Empty of their belongings, cleared of their presence, it felt bigger somehow, more spacious, like it could finally breathe without the weight of their expectations pressing down on every room. I walked through the mansion slowly, my footsteps echoing in spaces that had been designed for entertaining hundreds of people, but felt perfectly comfortable housing just one person who wasn't afraid of taking up space. The formal dining room, stripped of the mahogany table where I'd endured so many uncomfortable meals, looked like a ballroom waiting for dancers. The library, emptied of Richard's leather-bound volumes, felt like a sanctuary where I could finally read in peace. The master bedroom suite was a revelation without Margaret's furniture and decor. The room was enormous, easily large enough for a king-sized bed, a sitting area, and a home office, with windows that looked out over the Pacific Ocean, like a constant reminder that I'd earned the right to wake up to beauty every morning. The ensuite bathroom was larger than the bedroom David and I had shared in our Manhattan beach house, with a soaking tub positioned to take advantage of the ocean view, and a shower that could comfortably accommodate 4 people. My phone rang as I was standing in the walk-in closet, a space that was currently empty but could easily hold the wardrobes of several people. The caller ID showed Claire's number, David's sister, calling for the first time since the night I'd made my initial offer. "Sarah, we need to talk." "Hello, Claire, what can I do for you?" "You can stop pretending this is normal. You can stop acting like buying your in-laws' house out from under them is just regular real estate business." I sat down on the built-in bench in the closet, surrounded by empty shelves and hanging rods that would soon hold clothes worthy of someone who lived in a mansion. "Claire, I bought a house that was offered for sale. Your parents accepted my offer. There's nothing abnormal about that. They didn't offer it for sale. You forced them to sell by making an offer they couldn't refuse. I made an offer they could absolutely refuse. They chose not to, because they needed the money." There it was, the admission I'd been waiting for. The Blackwood family, with all their talk about generational wealth and understanding what it takes to maintain quality, had needed the money. They'd been house poor, using their property as their primary asset while struggling to maintain the lifestyle their address demanded. If they needed the money, Claire, then I did them a favor. You destroyed our family. Your family destroyed itself. I just provided the catalyst. Claire was quiet for a moment, and I could hear voices in the background, probably her parents coaching her through this conversation from their temporary housing, wherever that was. "Mom wants to know if you'll let them buy the house back in a few years when they've had time to arrange better financing." I laughed, actually laughed out loud at the audacity of the request. "Claire, your parents just sold me this house for nearly $3 million. What makes you think they'll be in a better financial position to buy it back in a few years? Dad's consulting business is picking up. Mom might go back to work. We're all going to help contribute." "Stop, just stop. The house isn't for sale, Claire. Not now, not in a few years, not ever. This is my home now." But it's been in our family for 3 generations. And now it's in my family. That's how real estate works. That's how life works. Things change hands, people move on, new stories get written in old places. This is so cruel, Sarah. I never thought you were capable of being this cruel. I'm not being cruel, Claire. I'm being decisive. I'm being someone who refuses to apologize for having what other people want. After I hung up, I walked out to the gardens, where Margaret had hosted so many events designed to reinforce social hierarchies that no longer applied. The professional landscaping was immaculate, a testament to the power of money to create and maintain beauty. Soon, I'd be the one writing checks to the gardening service, the one deciding which flowers to plant and which trees to trim. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Can we meet? I want to see the house now that they're gone. I stared at the message for a long time, considering what it meant. David wanted to see the house, but more than that, he wanted to see me in the house, wanted to understand what I'd become now that I was no longer the grateful wife who'd been rescued from poverty by his family's acceptance. You can come over, I texted back, but understand that you're visiting my house now, not your childhood home. An hour later, David stood in my foyer, looking around with the bewildered expression of someone visiting a place that used to be familiar, but had somehow become foreign. Without his parents' furniture and artwork, without the carefully curated collection of expensive objects that had defined the space, the house looked different, bigger, more elegant, less cluttered with the weight of other people's expectations. It's so empty, he said quietly. It's so peaceful, I corrected. David walked through the room slowly, his footsteps echoing in spaces that had once been filled with his family's voices, their laughter, their casual cruelty disguised as concern for my well-being. In the dining room, he stopped and stared at the space where the mahogany table had dominated the room for 30 years. This is where we had Christmas dinner every year, he said. This is where your family spent 3 years making me feel like I didn't belong at Christmas dinner every year. Sarah, please, can't we move past this? Move past what, David? Move past the fact that you never defended me? Move past the fact that you were more comfortable with your parents' version of who I was than with who I actually am? David turned to face me, and I could see the weight of the last few weeks in his eyes. I want to try. I want to learn how to be married to you, the real you, not the version I created in my head. Do you? Because wanting to try and actually trying are two different things. What would trying look like? It was a fair question, and one I'd been thinking about since he'd called. What would it look like for David to actually see me as an equal partner instead of someone he'd rescued from poverty? What would it look like for him to support my decisions instead of constantly trying to protect other people from their consequences? Trying would look like you being proud of what I've accomplished instead of embarrassed by it. Trying would look like you standing with me instead of trying to mediate between me and people who treated me badly. I can do that. Can you? Because doing that means acknowledging that your parents were wrong about me, that they treated me badly, that they deserved to lose this house. David was quiet for a long moment, looking around the empty rooms where he'd grown up believing that wealth and status were inherited rather than earned, that some people deserved beautiful things, and others should be grateful for whatever scraps they were offered. They did treat you badly, Eddie, he said finally, and I let them do it because it was easier than confronting them. And now I want to be married to the woman who owns this house, the woman who proved she belongs anywhere she chooses to be. I looked at my husband, this man who'd married someone he thought he understood and discovered he'd been living with a stranger for 3 years. Then welcome to my house, David. Let me show you around. The Architectural Digest photographer arrived on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks later, accompanied by a styling team that transformed my mansion into something that belonged on magazine covers. They moved through the rooms with professional efficiency, adjusting lighting and rearranging furniture I'd carefully selected to replace the Blackwood family's ornate collection. Where Margaret had favored heavy mahogany and faded Persian rugs, I'd chosen clean lines and natural materials that let the house's architecture speak for itself. This place has incredible bones, said Miranda Chen, the lead photographer, as she set up her equipment in the living room. The original craftsmanship is stunning. You've done a beautiful job honoring the house's history while making it completely your own. I watched her team work, remembering the first time I'd walked into this room as David's girlfriend, how small Margaret had made me feel with her casual comments about people who didn't understand quality. Now stylists were arranging my furniture, my artwork, my carefully chosen accessories, creating beauty that would be preserved in glossy pages and shared with readers across the country. The feature is going to focus on the renovation philosophy, Miranda continued, adjusting her camera settings, how you've modernized the space while preserving its historic character. Our readers love transformation stories, especially when they involve someone with such a clear vision. A clear vision. That's what they were calling it now, this decision to stop being small, to stop apologizing for deserving beautiful things. The magazine didn't need to know about the family drama that had led to this purchase, didn't need to understand that every room in this house represented a victory over people who'd tried to keep me in my place. They just saw a successful woman who'd bought a historic mansion and turned it into something spectacular. David appeared in the doorway, home early from work to witness the photo shoot. He'd been living back in the house for 3 weeks now, adjusting to life as the husband of someone who owned a mansion rather than someone who'd married into a family that owned one. The transition hadn't been easy, but he was trying, making an effort to see me as I actually was instead of who he'd assumed I was. They want to photograph us together in the master bedroom, he said, approaching carefully. We were still navigating this new dynamic, still learning how to be married when the fundamental assumptions about our relationship had been overturned. Do you want to be photographed with me? I asked. I want to be married to you, he said, which wasn't exactly the same thing, but was probably the most honest answer he could give. The master bedroom had been transformed into something from a luxury hotel, all crisp white linens and carefully placed books and flowers that looked artfully casual but had actually been positioned by professional stylists. Miranda directed us through a series of poses designed to look natural while showcasing the room's best features. You two have such interesting energy, she said, adjusting her camera angle. There's something powerful about couples who've built something together, who've overcome challenges to create the life they want. If only she knew, I thought, watching David try to look comfortable being photographed in a bedroom he'd never expected to own. We hadn't built this together, hadn't overcome challenges as a team. I'd built this alone, while he'd remained loyal to people who'd treated his wife like hired help. But we were learning, slowly, how to be partners instead of provider and provided for. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the Architectural Digest announcement online. Congratulations on the feature. The house looks beautiful. M double quote. Margaret. Somehow she'd found out about the magazine shoot, probably through mutual friends or social media, and felt compelled to reach out. I showed the message to David, watching his face as he processed his mother's attempt at reconciliation. She's trying, he said quietly. She's trying to maintain a connection to the house she lost because she couldn't treat me with basic human dignity. Maybe she's genuinely trying to make amends? Maybe, but amends aren't the same thing as consequences. The photo shoot continued for 3 hours, capturing every room I'd carefully redesigned, every space where I'd replaced Margaret's heavy-handed decorating with something that reflected my own aesthetic. The kitchen, where she'd once explained to me why people from my background couldn't understand quality, now featured clean lines and professional-grade appliances I'd chosen myself. The dining room, where I'd endured so many uncomfortable family meals, now showcased a table I'd selected for its craftsmanship rather than its ability to intimidate guests. We'll also want some photos of you alone, Miranda said as her team packed up their equipment. Our readers love seeing the homeowner in their element, especially someone with such an inspiring story. An inspiring story. That's what my life had become in the retelling, stripped of its messy emotional complexity and reduced to a narrative about success and self-determination. The magazine would never mention the years of casual cruelty I'd endured, the way I'd been made to feel grateful for scraps of acceptance from people who'd never deserved my respect. They'd focus on the triumph, the beautiful house, the woman who'd earned her place in a world that had tried to exclude her. After the photographer left, David and I sat in our living room, surrounded by furniture I'd chosen and artwork I'd purchased, in a house I'd bought with money I'd earned through my own intelligence and discipline. The silence between us was comfortable for the first time in months, the quiet of two people who were finally starting to understand each other. I called my parents today, David said eventually. How are they? Adjusting. They found a condo in Santa Monica. Something smaller, but still nice. Dad's talking about downsizing as a positive thing. Freedom from the responsibility of maintaining such a large property. I almost smiled at that. Richard was rewriting history to make their forced sale sound like a choice, turning necessity into philosophy the way wealthy people always did, when reality didn't match their preferred narrative. And your mother? Still angry. Still convinced you did this to hurt them rather than because you wanted the house. Does it matter what she's convinced of? David considered the question seriously. Not to you, probably, but it matters to me because I want to have a relationship with my parents, and I want to be married to you. And those two things feel impossible when you're all so angry at each other. I'm not angry anymore, David. Anger requires energy I'd rather spend on other things. Then what are you? I looked around the living room, at the beautiful space I'd created in a house I'd earned the right to own, thinking about the magazine feature that would soon introduce me to readers as someone who belonged in places like this. I'm free, I said finally. Free from caring what people think I deserve. Free from making myself smaller to make other people comfortable. Free from apologizing for having more than people expected me to have. David nodded slowly, processing what that meant for our marriage, for his relationship with his parents, for the family dynamics that had defined his life until now. I want to be free too, he said. Free from choosing between my wife and my parents. Free from trying to protect everyone from consequences they brought on themselves. Are you sure? Because being free means accepting that your parents lost this house because of their own behavior, not because I'm cruel or vindictive. I'm sure. That evening, as the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that were perfectly framed by the master bedroom windows, I stood in the house that had once represented everything I supposedly couldn't understand or afford. The magazine would hit newsstands in 6 weeks, featuring photographs of rooms where I'd once been made to feel like an intruder, but now belonged completely. My phone buzzed with another message, this one from Claire. Saw online that you're going to be in Architectural Digest. Mom's friends are all talking about it. She's devastated. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Margaret's devastation wasn't my responsibility anymore. Her friends' opinions weren't my concern. The only thing that mattered was that I'd built something beautiful in a place where I'd once been told I didn't belong. The house was quiet around me, peaceful in a way it had never been when it belonged to people who'd used it as a weapon to establish their superiority over others. Now it was just a beautiful place where someone could build whatever life they chose, and that someone was me. I'd won more than just a real estate transaction. I'd won the right to take up space without apologizing, to own beautiful things without justifying my worthiness, to belong anywhere I chose to be. The mansion was just the beginning. The Architectural Digest issue hit newsstands on a crisp October morning, 6 months after I'd signed the papers that made me the owner of what the magazine called a masterpiece of 1920s architecture, brilliantly reimagined for contemporary living. I bought 3 copies from the newsstand near my old house in Manhattan Beach, the house David and I had sold to help fund the renovations that had transformed the Blackwood estate into something that was unmistakably mine. The cover featured the living room where Margaret had once held court, but it looked nothing like the space where I'd been made to feel small. Gone were the heavy drapes and ornate furniture that had been designed to intimidate rather than welcome. In their place were clean lines, natural materials, and carefully chosen pieces that reflected my own aesthetic rather than someone else's idea of what wealth should look like. The 6-page spread inside was even more stunning. Miranda Chen had captured every room I'd renovated, every space where I'd erased the Blackwood family's heavy-handed decorating and replaced it with something that honored the house's bones while making it completely my own. The master bedroom, photographed in golden afternoon light, looked like something from a luxury resort. The kitchen, stripped of Margaret's fussy details and updated with professional-grade appliances, appeared both functional and elegant. But it was the written profile that surprised me most. The journalist, a woman named Rebecca Santos, had somehow managed to tell my story without sensationalizing the family drama that had led to the purchase. Instead, she'd focused on my journey from military service to successful investor, painting a picture of someone who'd earned her place in a world that often excluded people like me. Martinez represents a new generation of homeowners, Santos had written. People who've built wealth through intelligence and discipline rather than inheritance, who see historic properties not as symbols of social status, but as beautiful spaces worthy of preservation and reimagination. I was reading the article for the third time when my phone rang. Janet Kim, my financial advisor, calling with barely contained excitement. Sarah, have you seen the response to the Architectural Digest feature? My phone hasn't stopped ringing. Investment firms want to know about your portfolio strategy. Real estate developers want to partner with you on renovation projects, and I've had 3 different wealth management companies try to poach you as a client. Poach me? They want to manage your assets. They're assuming someone with your investment success must have much more money than what we've disclosed publicly. I laughed, looking around the kitchen where Richard had once lectured me about municipal bonds, while assuming I needed basic financial concepts explained in simple terms. How much more do they think I have? Based on the house purchase and renovation costs, they're estimating somewhere in the range of 10 to 15 million in total assets. The number was close enough to the truth to be uncomfortable. Between my investments, rental properties, and the appreciation on assets I'd been quietly accumulating for over a decade, my net worth had indeed crossed into 8 figures. But I'd learned long ago that actual wealth meant having the freedom to choose, not just the numbers in investment accounts. What did you tell them? That my client values her privacy and isn't interested in changing advisors. But Sarah, this kind of attention could be an opportunity. People are fascinated by your story. My story. As if my life were something that could be packaged and sold. A narrative about overcoming obstacles and achieving success that other people could consume for inspiration. The truth was messier than that, full of hurt feelings and complicated family dynamics, and the slow, painful process of learning to believe I deserved beautiful things. David walked into the kitchen carrying his own copy of the magazine, his expression unreadable. "You look beautiful in these photos," he said quietly. "Thank you." My mother called this morning. She wanted to know if I'd seen the article. I waited, unsure whether this conversation would end in another argument about family loyalty and hurt feelings, or whether David had finally learned to stand with his wife instead of trying to mediate between competing loyalties. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I was proud of you. I told her the house looks better than it ever has, and that you deserve every word of recognition you're getting." The admission surprised me. 6 months ago, David would have found a way to avoid taking sides, would have offered Margaret comfort while asking me to be more understanding. Now he was choosing my success over his mother's feelings, supporting my achievements instead of apologizing for them. How did she take that? Not well. She said I've changed, that I'm not the son she raised. Have you changed? David set the magazine on the counter and looked around the kitchen that was now ours, not theirs, filled with appliances I'd chosen and furniture that reflected our shared life, rather than his family's expectations. Yes, he said simply. I've changed from someone who was afraid of his wife's strength into someone who's proud of it. My phone buzzed with another call. This one from a number I didn't recognize, but a name that made my heart race. Elena Rodriguez, the reporter who'd called months ago about featuring the house. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Elena Rodriguez from Los Angeles Magazine. We spoke about your house purchase earlier this year." I remember. "We'd love to do a follow-up piece about the Architectural Digest feature and what it's meant for you personally. The story of how you went from being underestimated by your in-laws to owning one of the most beautiful homes in Los Angeles has really resonated with our readers." Being underestimated by my in-laws. The phrase reduced 3 years of casual cruelty to a simple misunderstanding, as if Margaret's comments about my background and Richard's lectures about finances, I understood better than he did, were just minor miscalculations rather than deliberate attempts to keep me in my place. "I appreciate the interest," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure I want to focus on family dynamics in interviews." "Of course I understand, but the broader story about earned wealth versus inherited wealth, about people who build their own success rather than relying on family money, that's something our readers are really interested in right now. After I hung up, David and I sat in our kitchen, looking at magazine photos of rooms where we'd built a life together despite all the forces that had tried to tear us apart. The morning sun streamed through windows that looked out over gardens I now paid to maintain in a house I'd bought with money I'd earned through my own intelligence and discipline. Do you ever regret it? David asked. Buying the house, forcing the confrontation with my parents, changing everything? I considered the question seriously, thinking about all the ways my life had transformed since that night when I'd made an offer everyone assumed I couldn't afford. I'd gained a mansion, but lost the illusion that I could ever be fully accepted by David's family. I'd proven my worth, but discovered that proving your worth to people who'd never respected you was ultimately meaningless. I'd won the war, but learned that victory sometimes felt lonelier than defeat. I don't regret buying the house, I said finally. I regret that it took buying the house to get basic respect from people who should have given it freely. And us? Do you regret staying married? I looked at my husband, this man who'd slowly learned to see me as I actually was instead of who he'd assumed I was, who'd chosen my success over his family's comfort, who'd grown from someone who'd wanted to rescue me into someone who was proud to be rescued by me. No, I said, I don't regret us. That afternoon, I walked through the mansion alone, moving from room to room in the house where I'd once been, made to feel like an intruder, but now belonged completely. The formal dining room where I'd endured so many uncomfortable family meals now held a table I'd chosen, surrounded by chairs that welcomed guests instead of intimidating them. The library where Richard had once lectured me about investments was now filled with books I'd selected, creating a space for learning rather than showing off. In the master bedroom, I stood at the windows that looked out over the Pacific Ocean, watching the waves crash against the shore with the same relentless rhythm they'd maintained for millions of years. The house around me was beautiful, peaceful, mine in a way that had nothing to do with deeds or mortgages, and everything to do with finally understanding that I belonged anywhere I chose to be. My phone buzzed with one final message of the day, this one from Margaret. I saw the magazine article. The house looks beautiful. I hope you're happy there. I stared at the message for a long time. This closest thing to an apology I was likely to ever receive from a woman who'd spent 3 years making me feel like I didn't deserve beautiful things. There was no admission of wrongdoing, no acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused, just a simple statement that could be interpreted as acceptance or defeat or genuine good wishes. I deleted the message without responding, not out of cruelty, but out of completion. The conversation between Margaret and me was over, had been over the moment I'd signed the papers that made me the owner of her family's legacy. What mattered now wasn't her belated recognition of my success, but my own understanding that I'd never needed her approval in the first place. The sun was setting over the ocean, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that were perfectly framed by windows in a house that had once represented everything I supposedly couldn't understand or afford. Now it was just home, the place where I'd learned that belonging isn't something you're granted by other people, but something you claim for yourself with the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're worth. I'd bought more than a mansion. I'd bought my freedom from other people's expectations, my liberation from the need to make myself small, to make others comfortable. The house was beautiful, but the real victory was the woman who lived in it, someone who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space and started building the life she'd always deserved. 1 year later, I hosted my first charity gala in the ballroom where Margaret had once held court. But instead of reinforcing social hierarchies, my event raised money for financial literacy programs for military veterans, people like me who'd served their country and deserved to understand how to build wealth when they returned home. The guest list included tech entrepreneurs, real estate moguls, and investment advisors, but also veterans who were just starting their financial journeys. I watched Maria Santos, a former Navy medic, network with venture capitalists while wearing a dress she'd bought at Target, her confidence unshakable because she understood that worth isn't measured by designer labels or family names. David stood beside me as we welcomed guests into our home, truly our home now, and I realized that the scared girl who'd once sat silently at family dinners was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that sometimes you have to buy your own seat at the table, but once you do, you get to decide who else sits there. As the evening wound down, I found myself back in the kitchen where this journey had begun, looking at a photo from the Architectural Digest spread. The house was the same, but everything else had changed. I'd learned that respect isn't inherited, it's earned, that belonging isn't granted, it's claimed, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all, but simply living well in spaces where you were once told you didn't belong. If this story inspired you to stand up for yourself and claim the respect you deserve, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Share your own stories of overcoming doubt in the comments below. Because your voice matters, your worth isn't negotiable, and you belong anywhere you choose to be. New stories of triumph every week. Don't let anyone make you small.